With more than 400 pistols reviewed on the channel, I often get questions and see comments about triggers. What's a good trigger? What's the best trigger? What's a terrible trigger? All that. I've gathered up a pile of pistols here that I think should help you understand what makes a good trigger, what it is that people love about some of the more common ones, like Walther and the Canik, as well as some wild cards you might not have expected to see. That's what's coming up next on GBGuns. First off, we need to define what is a good trigger. Well, that varies quite a bit depending on your skill level and your application. There's an article about this I'll link in as a pinned comment over on gbgunsdepot.com called The Fallacy of the Perfect Trigger. But in general, what we want in a trigger is one that is predictable, one that we know when it's going to go off and we can have control of the firearm, because basically the trigger is the difference between shooting and not shooting, and depending on your application that can have serious repercussions depending on where the shot went if you fire the shot. I've grabbed the Smith & Wesson SD9VE, sorry, the names of this has changed so many times, as an example of the typical horrid striker fired trigger, and I'll show you why. First off, we got clear, and you should be able to hear what's going on here. As I depress this trigger, it is moving the striker all the way to the rear and then releasing it. And so you end up with spring pressure that you're fighting against, both on the trigger itself, the internal safeties, and then that spring that's on the striker. And that's where the weight and the feel comes from or is lost. Hopefully you guys could hear that spring creaking in there. So we have a little bit of take up that brings us to what we think is the wall, and we have to steadily build pressure all the way through until the break. That makes it hard to know when this thing is going to fire for sure. In fact, the surest way to shoot a trigger like this is just to pull right through. The problem with that, and where a lot of people go for light triggers, is a light trigger can sort of, it's not cheating, but it can help correct or compensate for bad shooting form. Because if you have a heavy trigger and you have to pull right through, see how the gun dipped there? That's because by the time it went off, my hand was flexing so much that I was squeezing the pistol. This is where a heavy trigger can be challenging to shoot. That's not to say that it can't be done right. Let's see if I can do this without moving the gun. There you go. Just a little bit of move after the fact, after the striker dropped. But this is a trigger that is hard to know when it's going to go off, and the reset is all the way back out here, and you have to start that process all over again, much like shooting a double action. These types of triggers are good for safety's sake. As far as the thing's not going to go off accidentally, you've got to be really determined to fire it. However, they're not much fun on the range, hard to predict. This one will wear out your hand unless you're shooting double action revolvers all the time, and so that's where complaints come from about this kind of stuff. Maybe not terrible as a defensive choice, but if you're only buying one gun, or you're looking for your gun to serve multiple roles for you, it's going to be tough to train with this thing, tough to gain confidence, and that's a big part of firearms ownership, is the confidence that they provide. So if you can't shoot it well, you're going to think that you suck as a shooter, and then not be confident in having the gun. That's where the complaints come in with this. Now, the OG of awesome striker fired triggers, or the first time that people got excited about a striker fired trigger, is the Walther P99. This is my old P99 AS, and you notice there we've got the striker protruding. That's because the striker is pre-cocked. So a lot of that weight and that spring noise that I hope the camera picked up on the Springfield, or sorry, the Smith & Wesson, is not happening in here, because the striker is already back. What we're going to do is be releasing it. That's taken weight out of the trigger pull, and that's taken a lot of the feel and the stacking and having to increase weight. Now, this particular gun has 3 trigger modes. I won't get into that here. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out the dedicated videos I have on the P99. Spectacular gun that's been around for decades. So that was an anti-stress mode. Don't worry about that. We have spring tension to a wall. A little bit of movement. breaks all the way at the end, and then the reset for follow-up shots, for those who like to keep their trigger pinned, as I do, is incredibly short. Right there, the pistol's now ready to fire again. And as a result, that allows for very controllable shots. We'll see if I do this without dipping the gun. A little bit. I am at an awkward angle. You guys may or may not understand the angle that I film these videos at. But the point is, this is a trigger that could be learned, understood, and mastered quickly. So that makes shooting a lot more fun, also builds a lot more confidence, and as I said earlier, that's what makes things... That's a core part of shooting, right? If you don't have confidence in it, it's a dangerous thing to be around. So the P99 revolutionized things with that precock striker. There you go, popping out the back end. Now, once this technology became, well, apparent that it was something that people wanted, Canik was quick to jump on board. There's our striker sticking on the back end, and we have a light take up to a clean wall. A little bit of creep, break, resets right there, break again. That's what's made Caniks incredibly popular in all of their sizes. This happens to be the Mente SFT. Walther continued to do it. This is a Q5 match steel frame. You don't see it there, but come to the wall, little creep, break, short reset. That resonance sure is different than this all steel gun, isn't it? That's where the whole Walther Canik thing has come from. And I've got some other examples to show you where it is and isn't any different. Of recent excitement is Canik's own steel frame gun. This is the Rival S, and it's got a flat face trigger. This is something that some people like, some people don't, because it lets you get it's a different sensation. Right, it's really just feel. All the shoe does is change how it feels, but you'll see the trigger comes to the wall, break, short reset, break again. It's essentially the same trigger, it just feels a little bit different. Now, for defensive use, some would argue, and I might join in that crowd, that a trigger like this may be a little bit on the too light side for defense. Reason being, depending on your training, and to some extent regardless of your training, when you're under duress, when you are stressed out, panicked, fearing for your life or the life of a loved one, some of your training will go out the window, some of your knowledge will go out the window, and you might be resting on that trigger, waiting for that moment, and then all it takes is a little bump to have fired. That's where triggers like this are excellent on the range and for competition. But unless you train a lot with it, be very careful about having something like this as a defensive trigger. And in this Q5 match, we've got Walther's own, I forget what they're calling this, but this is Walther's step-up trigger, if you will. It's available aftermarket when you can find it. It's also coming in some of the newer models, I believe, as the Pro. And I'll show you why I have it in this obvious competition range-only gun. That's all the travel there is to the wall. And the break. Reset. Right there. And break again. Very, very quick trigger. Excellent for fast shooting. Would you want a defensive gun? That's up to you. And now for some wild cards that you may not have heard about or may not have thought about for having excellent triggers, because, well, some of these guns you just don't see around all that often. Walther and Canik are known go-tos. This is the Tisas Pagana PX9 Gen 3 Duty, and watch this. Wall's right there. A little bit of building weight, good break. Reset at a moderate length, but right back at the wall again for a little build and break. Now, compared to that Walther trigger I just showed you, you might be wondering, what's so special about that? This trigger, to me, travel-wise and weight-wise, travels in how much the trigger has to move, and that weight is in how much pressure, is much more appropriate for something that is going to be carried. And it's ironically on the Duty Model PX9 Gen 3. However, I think this is a great trigger that is very predictable. You can still pull through if you want to, like that, or stage, fire. Very predictable trigger of a decent weight and travel that makes it more general purpose, makes it, in my opinion, maybe a little more fitting for carry or duty use without being so long and heavy and terrible that it's going to throw your shots off. Here's a quiet one, as in the Gram Power striker fired pistols you don't see or hear a lot about. This is the Q1S, and with this revision to the triggers that they made a couple years back, right to the wall, there's almost no weight in this take-up. Break. Reset of a moderate length, but right at the wall, and break again. Now the pull weight on this is a little bit heavier than the Canik or Walther you saw, but it is a very stageable, easy to be precise with trigger from a company that, other than this channel, you don't hear a whole lot about Gram Power, and you certainly don't hear a lot about their striker fired guns. But if you're looking for a striker fired trigger to rival the Canik and Walther experience, maybe even be better depending on your application, consider the Gram Power Q line. There's some hidden gems in there. And another definite wild card, the Bersa BP9 CC and BP380 CC. These are the little single stack ultra thin guns. I carried this one for a while specifically because it's so thin, but the trigger on these things is pretty damn good. It makes me wish, wonder, and wait for more Bersa striker fired guns because I'd love to have this trigger in a bigger gun. Watch this. You see it's pivoting for the take-up, not actually traveling. We get a little bit of creep. Break. Nothing too magical, but this reset is about the shortest I've ever seen on a pistol. The weight on it is still, I think, carryable. In the past I said it was maybe too light, but my perspective has changed over time with experience and training. So I don't say it's too light for carry, but it is a very, very fast trigger. I dumped all 8+1 rounds out of this thing in a second and a half once, just trying to see how quick I could run it. Very, very quick. It's like double clicking a mouse. This space gun is one of the older generation Steyrs. I'm using the older one because in at least my example of the new A2, the newer Steyrs, they lost some of the trigger magic. But this funky gun of Bubit's design, take up to a very defined wall, break. Our reset, decent. Not the shortest, but definitely not medium. And clean break again. These had spectacular triggers on them. The newer Steyr that we reviewed a while back, I couldn't say the same thing about. I don't know if there was a change in the gun or it's just that my older Steyrs have more rounds through them and so things have loosened up. And that's another factor you need to consider, is a lot of guns will get better triggers over time. And the last wild card is a Glock trigger. Now this is an aftermarket trigger. Glocks are notorious for the, as a friend of mine once described it, dragging a trash can through gravel trigger experience. This is the MCARBO trigger. We have a dedicated video on this. They wanted me to try it out. I was kind of not interested because, well, I'm kind of bored with Glocks. It's been a long time since I've done much with them, but I decided to give it a try anyways. Now there are some other internal modifications to this thing. As you can see, the holster wear on this. I used to compete with this gun over a decade ago, so I don't remember what all's changed inside, but I do know that when I installed this MCARBO trigger, it changed this. It no longer has a Glock feeling trigger. Watch this. Minimal travel to the wall. Still has a little bit of the squish through trigger. That great reset Glocks are known for. And then from there on, I mean, once you get that initial squish done to about there, now you're ready to go. This could be run very quickly, very comfortable trigger. I just had to show it off because to me it was a massive surprise upgrade to Glocks. So if you have a Glock or Glock platform That doesn't mean you're stuck. This isn't an end-all be-all. It's not the only guns that I think have excellent triggers, but these are some of the top ones that stuck out in my mind when I was looking at my pile of guns and thought, who's got good triggers? I hope this helps you identify what can be a good trigger and what aspects you want to look for, because there's a lot of talk and a lot of noise on the internet. Oftentimes people with good intent but not always the right information, and then once that gets posted, it gets echoed and it turns into an echo chamber of good trigger, best trigger, best trigger, and that's all you ever hear without people maybe even knowing what makes a good trigger from a bad. It is a personal preference, but these are ones that in my experience with the hundreds of pistols reviewed that I think have excellent triggers and why I think they're great. I hope I explained the classics like Walther and Canik, why those stand out to so many people, and I hope this also helped show some wild cards that you maybe didn't think were ones to take a look at that have as good if not better triggers depending on what you're looking for. Thanks for watching.